From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to the Sculptors Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome to the Sculptors Funeral, a podcast for figurative sculptors working in the atelier tradition. I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor living and working in Florence, Italy, a city in which all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. So in the last episode, in which I laid out the general idea of what the Romantic movement in art was all about, I did something kind of odd. I didn't talk about Romantic sculpture. I mentioned painting, literature, plays, but not sculpture. That's because the Romantic era, which in general started in the 1760s and lasted until about the 1850s, didn't really affect sculpture in most places until after the fall of Napoleon in 1815. And even then, we don't really see the Romantic aesthetic take a stronghold in sculpture all the way until the 1830s. Romanticism was sort of old news by the time sculpture caught up to it. Neoclassicism in sculpture seemingly remained popular for a much longer period of time than it did in painting. So why was that? Well, there are a couple different reasons I can think of, and probably the biggest reason is the fundamental disparity between neoclassical painting and neoclassical sculpture. They really are two different animals. For starters, the surviving artwork from the classical world is overwhelmingly sculptural. There are several painted frescoes that did survive and influenced painters like Mangs and David, whose takes on classical painting influenced others. But in sculpture, the surviving artwork is much more abundant and explicit. We know, for example, exactly what a classic Greek marble Venus should look like, because we have several intact examples to choose from and to draw inspiration from. And so if I make my own marble Venus in the neoclassical style, then others can judge it against classical examples and determine how true I have been to the classical aesthetic. But in painting, it's almost impossible to do that. Our knowledge of how the Greeks and Romans painted is much more limited, and examples are rare and far-flung. This meant that neoclassical painters had the freedom to be much more speculative in their neoclassicism, and more inventive, without ever having to contradict what was known about classical painting. From the beginning, neoclassical painters just had a freer hand than sculptors. Painters also got away with utilizing more modern materials and techniques than sculptors ever could, because classical sculpture means white marble, right? End of story. But even the most classically oriented painters used modern colors and mediums. They used oil paint rather than making frescoes, and they never felt the need to ignore more modern techniques such as sfumato and chiaroscuro, or three-point perspective, and more modern concepts of composition and rendering. It seems all a painter needed to do to make a neoclassical painting was choose a classical subject, exhibit a certain starkness in line and color, and a certain stiffness in pose. Everything else in the painting had to be guesswork when it came to emulation of the Greeks. So right from the start of the neoclassical movement, there was an inventiveness in painting that was not and could not be present in neoclassical sculpture. Painters and sculptors both followed the rules of classicism, but sculptors just had many more rules. And once these rules were known, they were taught in places like the Academy in Paris, and the abundance of classical statuary, both in original works and in countless plaster casts, had an effect on how sculpture was taught. So abundant were examples of classical sculpture that sculptors found they had little call for a prolonged and intense study of the living model in order to emulate the Greeks. The academies never stopped using live models, of course, but much more emphasis was placed on copying from the antique. It is where sculptors learned taste. Painters also were trained to draw from antique statuary. It's where they learned taste as well. But the nature of painting required more reliance on living models. Statues generally are single figures or maybe 2 or 3 figures. The repertoire of types a sculptor needed was much smaller than the needs of a painter, who might have 20 or 30 recognizable faces in a single painting. Also, in sculpture, contrapposto reigned supreme as the pose for just about any classical character. It was practically thought to be an error of taste not to have the figure in contrapposto, or at least directly referencing an antique pose. In painting, you can't have 20 people all standing in contrapposto. That would just look a little ridiculous. So a larger variety of poses and faces and ages and types were required for painters, and study from the nude was much more thorough for painting students at the Academy. I think this had a profound effect on sculpture at the time, and it is a big part of why sculpture came so late to the table of the Romantic movement. If all one's training was designed to produce explicitly classical forms, not just in pose, but in proportion, in anatomical structure, facial types, and so on, it might prove difficult to make the switch into something more naturalistic. As Leon Battista Alberti points out in his Renaissance treatise Della Statua, different sculptural techniques lead to different types of sculpture. Applying the techniques of idealization to create naturalistic sculpture, well, that just doesn't work. But techniques of idealization was all the Academy was teaching its sculptors. Copying from the antique, canons of proportion and so on are antithetical to the Romantic notion of individuality and personal feeling expressed in original work. Neoclassicism in sculpture was a fundamentally different language than the naturalism of, say, a Donatello or Jean-Antoine Houdon, a foreign language which, by the way, was officially discouraged by the academic system. So if Romanticism were to make the scene in sculpture, it would have to take a more naturalistic form, and that meant it would have to come from outside the academic system. And so it did. The man credited for being the father of naturalism in sculpture is Francois Rude, whose twisted and rocky path to his career in sculpture was as novel as the sculpture he made. The subject of Francois Rude is huge and complex and involved, and so for this episode I'm only going to focus, well, I'm not going to focus so much on his sculpture, per se, and not so much on the nuts and bolts of his technique either, but rather I'm going to discuss some facts about Rude's fascinating biography and the influences on his life and work, and then how he influenced the generations of French sculptors who came after him. So, Francois Rude was born near Dijon, France, in 1784. His father was a stove maker and a locksmith, and little Francois started his teenage years apprenticed to his father. Then, around 1800, Francois happened to see some sort of graduation ceremony for the Dijon Regional Arts Academy, which was sort of like a local branch of the National Academy, and he was bitten by the sculpture bug. Rude started attending classes part-time at the Academy. Apparently, he showed a great deal of talent, even though he only attended part-time. After 4 years of training, he received his first commission, in the form of a portrait bust. The bust was commissioned by a local tax inspector named Louis Fremier, and Francois Rude and Monsieur Fremier became good friends. It's possible that Louis Fremier knew Francois's father. They certainly shared the same political philosophy, in that they were both ardent supporters of the Revolution, and like many people in France, adored Napoleon. Francois, like many French young men at the time, worshipped the heroic general-turned-emperor, and his loyalty to Napoleon and the ideals of the Revolution would stay with him for the rest of his life, and play a decisive role in his future at several points. So when Francois Rude was 21, in 1805, his father died, and he was more or less adopted by Louis Fremier and the large and happy Fremier family. Less than 2 years later, when Louis Fremier moved to Paris for business, Rude went with him, taking along with him a letter of introduction from the director of the Dijon Academy to the director of the Louvre, then known as the Musée Napoleon. And through this connection, Rude was enrolled into the National Academy School in Paris, known eventually, of course, as the École des Beaux-Arts. Now, entering the École at the age of 23 made Rude one of the older beginning students. And it's to Francois Rude's credit that he rose quickly through the school's arduous ranking process and won the coveted Prix de Rome after only 4 years, beating out students who had been attending the Academy for far longer than he. As we know, success in the National Academy in Paris meant conforming to official taste and producing exactly what was expected of you. And Rude's work was no exception. The sculpture he had made that won him top honors is titled Aristeas Mourning the Loss of His Bees. Now, before we get into what this sculpture looks like, who the heck is Aristeas, and why is he mourning some bees? Well, The subject of Rude's work is a perfect example of some of the problems with the Academy system at this time. Remember, this is during the reign of the Emperor Napoleon, which meant it was during the reign of neoclassicism. Fundamental to official taste and style was choosing subject matter from classical mythology, and by 1812, the year that Rude won the Prix de Rome, all the good myths had been done again and again, and it became harder to distinguish oneself within the strict limits of neoclassical taste, and so the more arcane and less-known myths were being mined for subject matter. So Aristeas was the son of Apollo and a god of pastoral pursuits like animal husbandry, cheese-making, and beekeeping. He was basically a farmer god, and his mythology includes the time when his bees started to die off, and he was eventually able to get new bees by offering sacrifices. And so Rude's sculpture of this tragedy shows a slender Aristeas leaning in classical contrapposto against a wicker beehive. Now, the plaster cast of this work has been destroyed, but a bronze version of the work, made by Rude years later, survives in the Dijon Museum. And the best you can really say about this work is that it is thoroughly competent. There's nothing wrong with it. But there's nothing that makes this work stand out. And without knowing the backstory of Aristeas, one can well imagine people just walking right by this work without stopping. It's just an unremarkable work without actually being bad. Yet it beat out many others to win the Prix de Rome in 1812. And this should tell us a lot about the state of the educational system for sculptors at this time in Paris. But hey, the Prix de Rome is the Prix de Rome, right? I mean, Rude could look forward to spending the next several years in Rome studying from the antique and building up his CV with studiously neoclassical work, then return to Paris and enjoy the patronage of empire under Napoleon. Except that none of that happened. In what I can only imagine to be a devastating blow, Rude was informed after he won that, due to the ongoing Napoleonic Wars and the budget cuts they necessitated, there was no funding put aside to send the winners of the Prix de Rome to Rome that year. They would have to wait to go with the next group of winners in the following year. So in the meantime, Rude stayed in Paris and landed a few small commissions in order to save up for Rome, as the Academy seemed to be offering less and less in terms of a scholarship. In fact, Rude didn't travel to Rome in 1813 either, because he was still short of funds. Finally, over 2 years after winning the grand prize, Rude sets off for Rome in early 1815, stopping off at Dijon in order to pay his respects to the members of the Frémier family who still lived in Dijon. Well, that little stop-off in Dijon would change the course of the rest of Rude's life. The Napoleonic Wars had been going on for years now, but in more recent years, a strong coalition of European nations had successfully diminished Napoleon's capacity to gobble up parts of Europe for inclusion into the French Empire. And these forces had finally backed Napoleon into a corner in 1814. Declaring that the coalition's fight was with Napoleon and not with France, this coalition of allied nations wished to put Louis XVIII on the throne and restore the French monarchy. With no options to turn to for the time being, Emperor Napoleon abdicated the throne. But let's not forget how beloved Napoleon was to many of the people in France. So instead of imprisoning him, Napoleon was sent into exile to the Mediterranean island of Elba, where he was allowed to rule as a sovereign on the island and even retain the title of emperor. And what came next is pretty amazing. Napoleon was in exile for less than a year before he managed to escape the island in February 1815 and return to the southern coast of France. As soon as word spread that Napoleon was back in France, an entire regiment of the French army was sent to recapture him and his small armed guard. When the regiment came into sight, Napoleon dismounted his horse, approached the regiment on foot, and called out, "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." The response of this regiment? They all mutinied and joined Napoleon's side, shouting, "Long live the emperor!" Napoleon and his brand-new regiment started marching northwards towards Paris, gathering troops and other supporters loyal to Napoleon and against the restoration of the monarchy as they went. The force became so large that King Louis XVIII fled Paris long before Napoleon's arrival, and when Napoleon got to Paris, he redeclared himself Emperor of France. Now, the Allied nations that had allowed Napoleon to be sent into exile had had enough, and they put together an enormous force to invade France and take Napoleon down once and for all. After just a few months back in power in Paris, a period now known as the 100 Days, Napoleon took his own enormous force on the offensive and engaged in battle at Waterloo in what is now Belgium. Napoleon was defeated. He retreated, and the political tides turned against him back in Paris, leading to his second abdication and his second exile, this time to a remote island in the middle of the South Atlantic. This exile would prove permanent. Now, where does Francois Rude fit into all this? Well, remember Rude's little stop-off in Dijon to say hi to the family on his way to Rome? This occurred at precisely the same time Napoleon escaped Elba and was marching north, passing near Dijon. Rude was Napoleon's #1 fan, and he joyously and publicly celebrated Napoleon's return. And under the restored empire during the 100 Days, Rude's equally Bonapartist protector, Louis Fremier, was given a new official appointment in the government of Dijon. So things were really looking up for the Fremier family. At least they did for about 100 days or so. Upon the news of Napoleon's second abdication, the order was made for the immediate arrest of Louis Fremier. Fremier fled to Brussels, leaving his wife and 2 daughters to the care of his friend, Francois Rude. 6 months later, Rude conveyed the Fremier family to Brussels and voluntarily remained with them, knowing that his own actions during the 100 Days had probably put his scholarship in jeopardy. And so, the winner of the 1812 Prix de Rome finds himself at the age of 32 with no hope for a period of study in Rome, no hope for patronage from the royal government, no career, and in exile in Belgium. And we'll discuss why this was to be the best thing to happen both to Rude and to possibly the entire course of 19th century sculpture, when the Sculptor's Funeral continues. Many sculptors and sculpture fans listening will be familiar with the works I'm discussing today, but many will not. If you are not, just go to the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and in the episode gallery of this podcast, you'll find many images that are relevant to today's discussion. While you're at thesculptorsfuneral.com, you can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. You can listen to every episode of The Sculptor's Funeral for free, and you can leave a comment or ask a question. Okay, so poor Francois Rude is now in exile in Brussels with his good friend and protector Louis Fremier and Fremier's extended family. But Rude and the Fremier family were hardly the only political refugees in Belgium. Many who were loyal and outspoken or held high partisan rank in Napoleon's empire had fled after the 100 Days, and Belgium was one of the many destinations for the diaspora. What's more, none other than the revolutionary painter Jacques-Louis David had also fled to Brussels. It's kind of amazing. I think I've mentioned David the painter in the last 3 or 4 podcast episodes. The guy's everywhere, it seems. He had interactions with several of the most prominent sculptors during his lifetime. It was David who effectively blacklisted the elderly Jean-Antoine Houdon and other members of the Académie Royale after the fall of Louis XVI. David met Canova in Rome, where they were both starting out their careers. And now David was to spend the remainder of his life in exile and obscurity alongside Francois Rude. Amid the exile community in Brussels, David was the celebrity, and he assisted his fellow exiles with introductions and connections wherever he could, and it was through David that Rude was introduced to the architect of the king, who was able to get Rude a few modest commissions here and there. It would be a stretch to say that Rude had a thriving career in Brussels, as he was often broke, and he lived a fairly modest life. Rude took a studio in a deconsecrated chapel, which had a second floor built into it, and he used the ground floor as a studio, and in a few years later, in 1820, he made the upper floor into a teaching atelier, and took in students. And somewhere along the way, Rude developed a relationship with Louis Fremier's oldest daughter, Sophie, and the two were married in 1821. Sophie Fremier also became a pupil of Jacques-Louis David, and became one of David's trusted copyists. She was actually quite talented. Francois and Sophie remained in Belgium for 12 years, from 1815 till 1827, before moving back to Paris. Now, at this point, most of Rude's biographies fast forward to 1827, when Rude returned to Paris, and where he, within a few short years, went from being a forgotten prodigy with no career to one of the most talked about sculptors in Paris. He became famous first for a figure of a Neapolitan fisher boy, and then this enormous relief on the Arc de Triomphe called The Departure of the Volunteers of 1792. And I'll discuss these works in a minute. Now, these works from Francois Rude, for many historians, mark the debut of Romanticism in sculpture, mostly due to Rude's seemingly revolutionary, naturalistic modeling style. And I suppose that for most art historians, that's enough to know about this period of Rude's story. But for me, a practicing sculptor, the first thing I want to know is what changed in Rude's technique, and how did it change? He was a thorough neoclassicist when he went to Brussels, but he comes back to Paris with a technique so revolutionary, he's been dubbed the father of naturalism in sculpture. What happened? How was his new technique different from his academy training? And where did he learn it? Well, just about every biography or monograph I've read on Rude, written in the 20th century, couldn't care less about recording what these changes were. Most biographers meet the question with a shrug of the shoulders, concerned only with that the change happened, and not with the mechanics of that change. Fortunately, the question of technique occurred to some of Rude's earliest biographers, and there does exist some brief passages about Rude's life and teaching in Brussels, which sheds a lot of light on the creative journey that Rude underwent, as well as on the man himself. The first biography of Francois Rude came out only a year after his death, in 1856, and was written by one of Rude's former students, a man named Maximin Legrand. The book is called, in English, Rude, His Life, His Work, and His Teaching. As the title implies, the book is divided into 3 sections: a biography, a discussion of Rude's sculpture, and then what looks like a set of step-by-step instructions of Rude's teaching method. Unfortunately, the part that we might be most interested in, the section which lays out his working method, it's not the end of the story in terms of Rude's technique, but really the beginning of a huge puzzle. The method outlined by Legrand raises as many questions as it answers and seems somehow incomplete, or else just entirely unworkable as a sculpting method. And then when we find out that this student author, Maximin Legrand, studied with Rude only for a year and became a writer rather than a sculptor, well, that complicates things even more. I mean, imagine all you sculpture teachers out there. If one of your random first-year students decided to write a book detailing your working method, how accurate and how complete would it be? In fact, the method Legrand details in his book is for the construction of a life-size figure, and it's very doubtful Legrand ever used the technique himself as he describes it. I mean, it would be indeed shocking if Rude, the teacher, allowed a first-year student to attempt a life-size figure. In light of all this, it's small wonder that Legrand's book has never really been taken seriously. It's never been translated into English or, as far as I can tell, any other language. And it's never been considered very important to historians or artists of later generations, because as it is, in terms of a sculpture manual, it's more or less useless. But as I said, the book is the beginning of a puzzle and not the end of the road for learning Rude's methods. This puzzle, by the way, is one of the most intriguing unanswered questions I have found in the history of figurative sculpture. And it's one that's been completely ignored by art historians and researchers. I started researching the issue 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and I continue to gather info and piece things together about Rude's technique. And I hope someday to publish not only the first English translation of Legrand's book, but also a lengthy commentary and fuller explanation of Rude's technique in the context of other techniques and in the context of art history. But I'll give you, the listeners of the Sculptor's Funeral, a bit of a sneak peek into my research. Not now, but in an upcoming episode, which I will devote to Legrand's record of Rude's techniques and its implications. But this current episode is going to stick to Rude's biography and just give a general overview of his methods and how they differ from what he learned at the Academy in Paris. So, back to Rude in Brussels. Now, we learn a lot about Francois Rude from Legrand's biographical chapter of his book. Legrand corresponded with Rude's first and longest studying pupil from this time in Brussels, a Monsieur Finot. Finot started working and studying with Rude even before Rude opened his atelier to students in 1820, and he was Rude's primary assistant during all his years in Brussels. Rude actually had 3 different ateliers. The first one, where the students all worked upstairs. But the number of his students grew very quickly, and he was forced to take a larger temporary space arranged for him by the king's architect. He finally was able to rent out a spacious, unused chapel known as the Chapel of the 12 Apostles in 1824, which he kept until his return to Paris. Anyway, by Finot's account, as well as from many other sources all through his life, Francois Rude was a charismatic and hardworking and contented and humble family man. He was very generous and open with his students, who all absolutely adored the guy, and he was a father figure to many of them. He was also a voracious reader, and he continually worked to improve his own education and the education of his pupils. To set the scene a bit, I'll quote from Monsieur Finot regarding the memories of Rude. In the summer, Rude came to the studio at sunrise. At 8 o'clock in the morning, someone brought him lunch. Sometimes when he was pressed, he contented himself with a roll or two and a little brandy. At noon, he ate another roll, and at 3 o'clock, he went for dinner. At 4 or 5 in the afternoon, it was back to the studio to work until night. I would meet up with him at the door, and when I would go, he'd say, "Monsieur Finot, whoever awakens first tomorrow will come around to awaken the other." Despite my goodwill and my precautions, Rude was always the first one up. Along the way, still rubbing my eyes, I asked him the time, finding the streets silent. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. All throughout the summer, our day began at sunrise. Rude was recently married, and on Sunday afternoon he walked in the countryside with his family, but on Monday morning he was always right back to his model. He liked to be read to while he worked, and every day I or another student would read aloud to him. In the winter, after working in the studio, he would draw and design by lamplight in the company of his family, almost always listening to music. It was always so happy there. What affection! How calm, how united his family was. I have often been admitted to those evenings, and I will never forget them. What wit and joy! It's such a great passage. It really sort of paints a scene of wholesomeness, and this impression is corroborated by many others throughout Rude's life. But enough about that. What about his little atelier in the attic of his studio? We turn again to Monsieur Finot for a description. Quote, Rude had strong views on the teaching of drawing and sculpture. One day, the attic of the studio was found to be transformed into an Academy of Fine Arts, and it was an artistic revolution in Brussels. The master, instead of paper, would give his students a black canvas stretched over a large frame, and instead of a pencil, a long stick, to the end of which was attached a piece of chalk. We always made our drawings the size of the model. The number of students rose quickly to some 20 persons, and some other artists joined their ranks. You could get a different model each week, and sometimes we had 2 in order to draw groups. Rude strongly condemned the custom of using the same model for every study, always the same model used year after year, or what was worse, not having a model at all. The students indicated on their black canvas the points, the major divisions of the figure, and its main projections by using compass and plumb line. Then connecting these points by a line, they got the outline of the whole, and then the figure was rendered. The master drew with his students, and he drew like them. Unquote. Okay, so that's a lot of info to take in there. Let's break it down a little bit. So first, using chalk on a black canvas. It's a brilliant way to save money on paper and pencils. It's worth noting, Rude did not charge his students. He did it all out of his passion for education and a desire to help others. I really respect Rude for this, especially in light of the modesty of his means at the time. He was not well off. Living in exile in Brussels instead of studying in Rome might well have left Rude with a big chip on his shoulder, but he really seems content with his situation and just happy to be busy in his studio. So Rude is having his students draw from life on these canvases and at the same scale of the live model. He's using plumb lines and compasses, so we can assume his teaching method had to have been similar to what we now know as comparative measurement drawing. The compasses thing, it's a bit of a puzzle because, a compass measures from point A to point B, sort of in a two-dimensional plane, but there's no consideration for foreshortening. And without that consideration, you end up with a faulty measurement. We might assume that the compasses were used more for general proportion measurements, comparing one body part to another, rather than being used to transfer measurements directly from the model to the canvas. I don't know of any painters or draftsmen that use compasses to draw on a canvas, so it's a little murky as to exactly what was going on. Also, notice that Rude condemns the practice of using the same model again and again, or not having a model at all. These practices, of course, were standard in the Academy in Paris for students of sculpture. Live models in the sculpture classes were for general reference to sort of fill in any gaps of information which were not supplied by antique examples, which would have been the primary source of information. Notice that Rude is not having his students copy from the antique at all. I can find no reference that suggests Rude ever did during his time in Brussels. It may have been an economic choice at first, but it's not like nude models are cheaper in the long run than a cast collection. The choice to not work from the antique was deliberate. Also absent in Rude's training was copying from copybooks, engravings and drawings made by other masters to teach students how to draw in the correct taste and style. Many listeners are probably familiar with the engravings of Charles Bargue, for example, which are in common use today in many teaching ateliers. But no, it was always from life in the Atelier Rude. And finally, notice that these students were drawing, not sculpting. The entirety of Rude's teaching at this point was not in how to sculpt or how to design in the neoclassical taste, nor to copy from the antique. It was all about learning to draw what you see. It was all about training the eye. This level of focus on the nude is rare, even in today's ateliers, where Bargue drawings and cast drawings are common practice. But in Rude's time, and especially in a sculpture atelier, this truly was a revolution. No one was teaching and learning like this anywhere. To illustrate this point, Maximin Legrand includes in his biography a short anecdote about the day Jacques-Louis David was brought to Rude's studio by Rude's wife, Sophie. David was looking for models, and he came to inspect the drawings Rude's students had made in order to see if their model would suit his purposes. The studio was empty of both Francois Rude and his students. When David saw the chalk drawings on black canvas, he asked Sophie, "Are these the drawings?" She responded, "Yes, these are the works of the beginner students." David takes out a piece of paper and a pencil, and he begins to draw an eye, a nose, and an ear in the studied academic style he practiced. "Here," he said, "give them this." The implication is that David thought the students needed to copy from his drawing in order to learn how to render in the correct way. So it is certain that Rude was working in and teaching a technique very much at odds with the prevailing style. But why? What inspired him to work and teach in this way? The few commissions he subsisted on during these years in exile specifically called for neoclassical style. For example, he produced a series of decorative relief panels he made depicting the exploits of Achilles. They decorated the royal palace. Now, true, there are a few portrait busts he made during these years, notably one of David himself, which are quite naturalistic compared to the standard classicizing that was in vogue, but they are hardly a revolution in sculpture, nor did their creation require a revolution. Well, remember the passage I read earlier, which said that Rude would have a student read aloud from books as they all worked. Well, one of the books which was read from, again and again, according to Maximin Legrand, was a book whose title, Recherche sur l'art statuaire, translated into English is Research on the Statuary Arts, and it was written by Toussaint Bernard Emeric David. According to Legrand, quote, Rude had conceived his plan of teaching in the work of Emeric David. Throughout his life, Rude continued to advise his students to read Recherche sur l'art statuaire. It was, according to him, the first book that a young artist had to have in his library. Maximin Legrand refers to and quotes Emeric David's book extensively in his discussions on sculpture and on Rude's conception of sculpture. So who was Toussaint Bernard Emeric David, and what was his book about? Emeric David was a man of letters and a bit of an armchair archaeologist. He was born in 1755, and he was very heavily influenced by the work of Johann Winckelmann, who, as we know, revolutionized the study of the classical world and brought a new understanding of classical sculpture to Europe. In a nutshell, Emmerich David was a Winckelmann wannabe. His book, Research on the Statuary Arts, published in 1805, is hugely indebted to Winckelmann, and much of the book covers similar ground or builds on top of Winckelmann's theories. But there is one aspect of this book which differs widely from Winckelmann, and it's this difference which won Emmerich David recognition from the Institut de France, and it is what inspired Rude to pursue a new path in sculpture. So basically, Emmerich David agrees with Winckelmann that the path to greatness in the arts lies in the emulation of the Greeks. But for Emmerich David, that meant something different than it did to Winckelmann. For Winckelmann, the greatness of Greek sculpture was a reflection of the noble greatness of Greek culture. So emulation of the Greeks meant the cultivation of a noble spirit which pursued the arts as a means of expression of this nobility. Calm simplicity and quiet grandeur, remember? But Emmerich David has a different idea about emulation. Here's a relevant passage from Maximin Legrand's book, which mentions Emmerich David's ideas. Legrand says, "How, then, did the Greek sculptor proceed in his workshop? Some say that he worked from mathematical canons, slavishly followed. Others say that to imitate his model, he employed the strength of his sentiment and the aid of his eye." Emmerich David refutes both of these opinions with a clarity and force which dispels all doubt. We will only summarize his argument. The Greek artist did not submit to the reproduction of the canons and absolute measurements without the influence of sentiment, any more than he abandoned himself to the inspiration of feeling without the control of measurement. Rather, he utilized the two terms of this dichotomy by means of a higher term, which solves, explains, and controls the other two. That is, by using a precise method of observation. Unquote. So in a nutshell, if you really want to emulate the Greeks, says Emmerich David, you don't copy the way Greek sculpture looks, you copy the way Greek sculptors worked. And according to Emmerich David, Greek sculptors had a precise method of observation, which united their expressive feeling with their canons and measurements. So at bottom, the greatness of Greek sculpture lies in observation of the natural world, tempered by both a scientific and an emotional exploration of the subject. It's this idea that inspired Francois Rude, with little else to do during his exile in Brussels, to develop an approach to sculpture more heavily grounded in observation of nature than in any other source. We'll see what sort of an impact this had on the strongholds of neoclassicism back in Paris when the Sculptors Funeral continues. Hey, podcast listeners, just a quick shout out for my new sponsor. In case you haven't heard the good news, the Sculptors Funeral is now brought to you in part by Blick Art Supplies, the oldest and largest supplier of professional art supplies in America. Everything a sculptor needs, from your favorite clay modeling tools, modeling stands, armature supplies, clays, plasters, molding and casting supplies. They have it all, and the shipping in the U.S. is free on most items if the order is over $100. And best of all, ordering your supplies from Blick Art Supplies directly supports the Sculptors Funeral podcast. Just go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, click on any of the Blick buttons you find on the homepage or on the episode pages, and shop away. A percentage of your purchase goes to support the show, and it's very much appreciated. So the next time you need art supplies, click on Blick. And thanks. Okay, so in his 12 years in exile, Francois Rude devises a new and exciting technique and is teaching this to a bunch of Belgian students. What was the result? What were the early fruits of this experiment? Well, unfortunately, it's almost impossible to say. We know maybe a half dozen names of Rude's students at this time, and almost no one went on to become an artist of much merit. The few who did either did so in a medium other than sculpture, like engravings or medallion work, and even these few students had received training elsewhere. And I suppose we shouldn't be too surprised that Rude's students didn't amount to much during this period of exile. After all, if you had ambitions to become a career artist, you went to Paris to study, or at least trained in the Brussels Academy, rather than in some attic of some talented young yet unknown sculptor. We might imagine that many of his students were part-timers and dilettantes rather than serious career artists. Even Rude's right-hand man, Monsieur Finot, he stopped sculpting after Rude left Brussels, and he became a successful local politician. Another of his known pupils became a journalist, and so it goes. It is apparent that the person who benefited most from Rude's experiments in technique, at least at this point, was Rude himself. And when Rude moved his family back to Paris in 1827, on the advice of a few friends, he came prepared to enter the Paris Salon for the first time, exhibiting a plaster cast of a work he created called Mercury Fastening His Sandals. It's a thoroughly neoclassical work, even if it is pretty inventive, and in fact it owes more to Giambologna's Mercury from the Italian Renaissance than it does to classic Greek work. So this and a few other works that Rude made when he first got back to Paris, they all exhibit the universally neoclassical style in which sculptors found success. I guess that should come as no surprise. He had been gone from the Paris scene for a long time, and he needed to prove himself, and his work was no less neoclassical than the work of his successful Parisian peers. Two of his old classmates from the Academy, James Pradier and David d'Angers, who had won the Prix de Rome in the year before and in the year after Rude, respectively, had found success producing standard, classically themed work. But by then, in the late 1820s and early 1830s, something had shifted in the studios of Paris. It's hard to say why 1831 was the year we find the Romantic movement finally take hold in French sculpture. It may have had something to do with the July Revolution of 1830, which was a small and thankfully quick revolution in France, which overthrew the hereditary monarchy, which itself had replaced Napoleon, and instituted a new constitutional monarchy. But it had to have been more than that. Francois Rude was not the only one experimenting with more observational techniques, and several sculptors had attempted early forays into the realm of Romanticism with limited success. And not just in Paris. For instance, back in Florence, you've got Lorenzo Bartolini. He was engaged in the same sort of pursuits. It was just in the air. And so, seemingly suddenly, we find that in the Salon of 1831, several works were exhibited that were a marked departure from the neoclassicism of the day. Nowadays, we say that Francois Rude was the father of naturalism and the first of the Romantic sculptors. But that's not entirely true. He was one of a small vanguard, of which he eventually became by far the most influential and important. Of the others of the vanguard, there was Antoine Barry, the famous animalier, the animal sculptor, but being an animal sculptor placed him a bit on the periphery, perhaps unfairly. And then there was the little-known sculptor Jehan Dussigneur, whose 1831 Salon sculpture called Orlando Furioso should rightfully be considered the first fully Romantic sculpture. But Dussigneur quickly turned to a much more conservative style and produced religious works for the rest of his career and had nowhere near the influence Rude's work did. For his part, in the same 1831 Salon, Rude exhibited a plaster cast of a figure he had recently modeled, called Neapolitan Fisher Boy Playing with a Tortoise. The sculpture is of a smiling youth about 10 years old, nude except for his Neapolitan cap and his little necklace. He's sitting on a bit of beach, and he's tugging at a little tortoise. Looking at this otherwise charming work, it's hard to imagine that this could be seen as a breakthrough in sculpture. But it really was. In fact, it was a bit of a sensation. This positive reception encouraged Rude to carve the work into marble, which he exhibited in the Salon 2 years later, in 1833. And the marble was bought by the French government, and Rude was awarded with the Cross of the Legion of Honor. But just what is so exceptional about this work? Is it simply because it was a non-classical theme, sculpted in a non-idealized manner? Could it really have been that simple to inaugurate Romantic sculpture? No. It was much more than that. First off, let's examine the subject matter itself. It's a 10-year-old boy playing on the beach. Followers of neoclassicism would have hated the idea of such a mundane genre subject represented in the noble art of marble sculpture. If it were some cherub or maybe Cupid playing, that would be a different matter, but this is just some random kid on a beach. How is one supposed to be driven to contemplation of noble sentiments with this as its subject? And yet, many neoclassicists had to admit it did precisely that. But it did it in a new way. Without using a classical model for precedence, in pose or in proportions, Rude created a figure whose expression of youthful joy is so effortless and natural that we, the viewers, forget for a short time that we're looking at a work of art and just focus on the joy inherent in the subject. The work charms us. But remember, that's very similar to one of the goals of neoclassicism, right? To look past the work of art itself and focus on the sentiment it represents. The reason it had taken so long for Romantic sculptors to be able to achieve this is a question of technique and style. If there had been one tiny bit of classical reference in Rude's Fisher Boy, a straight Greek nose, for instance, or studied musculature, any bit of Greekness at all, the work would have been a failure. Amidst all the naturalistic rendering, a reference to the classics would have made the rest of the work seem artificial, in the way that some neoclassical works can be ruined with naturalistic flourishes. In the words of historian H.W. Jansen, the Fisher Boy's body is observed directly from nature, without any concessions to, quote, beauty. The naturalism in Rude's work was complete and unified, in a way Europe hadn't seen since Houdon's remarkable portrait busts several decades previous. So in the end, it was a new naturalistic observational approach that allowed Rude to successfully give voice to the ideals of Romanticism. And it was Rude's choice in an endearing, inoffensive subject matter that allowed it to have popular appeal. When we look at Dusignor's Orlando Furioso, the other fully romantic work exhibited in the 1831 Salon, it's apparent that Dusignor was also experimenting with an observational technique. But we can also understand how Orlando Furioso's passionate, violent expression may just have been too much for the neoclassical authorities to stomach at such an early date. Works like Orlando Furioso, with its violent sentiments, would become common in the 1860s, but in 1831 it was just too far ahead of its time to have the same appeal as the more palatable Fisher Boy. The success of the Fisher Boy quickly led to Rude landing the biggest commission of his career, and what is regarded as his masterpiece. The Arc de Triomphe, Napoleon's unfinished monument to his own glory and the glory of the Revolution, was now being finished. Understandably, the Bourbon monarchy had little interest in glorifying Napoleon and had planned to turn it into something else. But after the July Revolution in 1830 and the reign of the new monarch, Louis Philippe, finishing the Arc de Triomphe as originally intended was seen as a compromise and an appeasement to the large section of the population who was not favorably disposed to any monarchy, even a constitutional one. On the Arc de Triomphe, there are 4 enormous reliefs, each which celebrate different periods in the Revolution. Rude was given the commission to create the relief titled The Departure of the Volunteers of 1792. Rude had to be careful to match the style and composition of his relief with the other 3, which were being done by 3 different sculptors, and which contained various bits of classicist and neo-Baroque passages, in an attempt to give the works an overall sense of heroic timelessness. While Rude conveyed the sense of heroic timelessness through neoclassical poses that could be straight out of a painting by David, really, but he holds on to his naturalistic rendering of the figures themselves, and this gives his work both a sense of timelessness and immediacy. This immediacy, this sense of individuality, allowed the Parisian populace to strongly identify themselves with the figures and emotions represented in the sculpture. And almost immediately the work became a beloved symbol and popularly nicknamed the Marseillaise, which, of course, as we know, is the name of the French national anthem, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Both the anthem and the sculpture were seen as encapsulations of the French national character. So one would think that with successes as sweeping as these, that neoclassicism was soon washed away and Romanticism reigned supreme in sculpture from the 1830s onward. Well, that wasn't the case at all. As notable and exciting as Romantic sculpture was at the time, the Académie Nationale and the Institute of France was still in power as the arbiter of official taste. and every academician was a neoclassicist. I mean, it's not like the professors of the Academy were going to resign en masse at the sight of Rude's Marseillaise. And it's not like the Academy was going to stop awarding the Prix de Rome, nor would winners of the Grand Prix refuse to go to Rome to study the classics. The system was too entrenched to allow any sort of quick or easy change. Neoclassicism was too big to fail. So how did the Academy and officialdom treat the Romanticism of Francois Rude? By largely ignoring him, anyone like him, and even anyone who studied with him. He applied for membership to the Academy 3 times, and he was rejected 3 times. This meant that Rude was not allowed to officially teach at the École, or to be on the jury of the Paris Salon, or enjoy other benefits awarded an academician. Most of the commissions he would receive for the rest of his life would be private rather than official commissions. Another big reason for his unpopularity was his lifelong commitment to Bonapartism during a period of rule by monarchy. Without friends in high places, Rude was consigned to a small corner of the Paris scene. He even stopped showing in the Paris Salon, mostly out of protest over the Academy's bias against other sculptors working in the Romantic styles. But Rude was all too familiar with exile, and he contentedly did his own thing and gave little thought to those who would try to block his advancement. He wasn't the kind of guy to pursue personal glory anyway. But then, in 1842, Francois Rude receives a letter from a group of sculpture students looking for a new master. To understand what these students were asking, it takes a little bit of explanation. You see, many students who were enrolled at the Academy's École, they would band together, they would pool their money, and rent out a shabby little studio of their own. In this studio, away from the Academy, they would practice their sculpture and complete projects on their own time outside of the regular classwork. These little studios were known as ateliers, which is just the French word for studio, of course. Now, these ateliers invited professional career artists and masters from the Academy to come regularly and critique the students' work. The ateliers became known by the name of the master they affiliated themselves with. Now, each master, of course, had their own style and approach to sculpture, and so students would enroll in the atelier whose master most closely reflected their own aspirations in sculpture. These ateliers were often closely knit, and a good deal of mutual affection was shared between master and atelier student. And masters usually did what they could to help their atelier students get a start in their careers, often employing them as assistants in their own professional studios. And so in 1842, the sculptor and academician David d'Angers suddenly gave up his atelier, leaving the Atelier d'Angers without a master. They apparently were unanimous in their desire to see d'Angers replaced with Francois Rude, and wrote him a letter asking him if he would. That letter doesn't survive, but Rude's response does, and it is well worth reading. It states, quote, "The word atelier, as the habits of the 18th and 19th centuries have caused it to be understood, signifies a sort of contract between the master on one hand and the pupils on the other, by which the pupils tacitly undertake to learn before all things the respect and adoration of their teacher, to celebrate his merits, and to copy his performances. The master, on his part, undertakes to use his official influence in their favor, to get work for them, and to make the road to official honors easier for them. A contract which reproduces in our day the old Roman arrangement between the patrician and his clients." Now let me just sort of paraphrase the rest, because it does go on. Rude gives a laundry list of reasons why he won't take the offer to teach the atelier. He told these students that such an agreement had always seemed pernicious to the arts and unworthy of artists, that he didn't want to exert any influence on free expression of young people, that by his position outside the Academy, his patronage could actually be harmful, that his character is opposed to doing for his students anything contrary to the strict requirements of his conscience, and therefore they should not expect favorable treatment in exhibitions when he was a member of the jury. And finally, his teaching, he says, consisted above all to put in the hands of students the means of liberation and to make them incur habits of independent spirit. And so his role as a teacher would be to demonstrate, if not the necessity, then at least the possibility of dispensing with a teacher altogether. What an amazing document. So Rude, obviously, he says no. He says no because he hates the idea of playing the Academy's games of patronage and special favors with students. He says no because not only could their affiliation with Rude by itself hurt their own careers, but Rude is only going to teach them how to be independent sculptors instead of following the well-worn path to success through the Academy. And here is the full response, which also survives, from the students back to Rude. Sir, the students of the Atelier David, all fully convinced that Monsieur Rude is the one who can continue what their master has accomplished thus far, come to plead again that he kindly accept them as students. They further state to Monsieur Rude that the paternal and benevolent observations he has been pleased to give them in a spirit of utmost care have struck a chord. But after they have sufficiently ripened in their minds, they still persist in not wanting any other master than he. As a result, they hasten to assure Monsieur Rude that they will never cease to make new efforts each day to merit more and more the most valuable advice he may wish to give, and pray he accept the expression of their deep respect and of their unalterable appreciation. So even after Rude warned them, the students of the Atelier David still wanted what Rude could teach them. And so, in 1842, the Atelier David d'Angers became the Atelier Rude. Rude worked with the Atelier for 10 years, and during this time, much of what he had warned the students about came true. Not one of Rude's students won the Prix de Rome while that student studied under Rude. Few were accepted into the Salon, especially compared to the success of students from other ateliers. But the tide was turning, and the students who chose to study with Francois Rude were doing so not to curry official favor and success, but to learn the language of Romanticism rooted in observational technique. In this group of adventurous, almost rebellious students, we find the future author Maximin Legrand, who would attempt to record Rude's techniques for posterity, but we also find Rude's own nephew, Emmanuel Fremier, who would go on to have a notable career. And crucially, we find studying at the Atelier Rude the most influential sculptor of the next generation, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. But that's a story I will save for another time. Oh, I hope you liked this episode. Rude is very, very close to my heart. I know this is one of my longer episodes, but I could go on talking about Rude for hours more. And actually, eventually, I will. I barely touched on his life's work. I only mentioned 3 sculptures by him. I haven't talked about the nuts and bolts of his revolutionary techniques, but I will in future episodes. Now please, don't forget that if you are a regular listener of the Sculptors Funeral, or even listening for the first time, take a moment and give the podcast a rating on iTunes, or even write a quick 1-sentence review there if you want. It's the best way you can promote the podcast, and those reviews and rankings affect how visible the podcast is on iTunes, and that makes it easier for others to find it. And of course, if you listen to the podcast on another service like Stitcher, you can rate the show there as well. Don't forget to check out our website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, which is the only place you can find the complete archive of the show and listen to it all for free. You can also support the show by clicking on the donate button you find there, or you can click the link to Blick Art Supplies and do a little shopping for all your sculpture needs and support the Sculptors Funeral at the same time. Finally, you can join us at the podcast Facebook page, The Sculptors Funeral, where you can engage me in conversation, discuss the podcast with your fellow sculptors and sculpture lovers, and more. Thanks again so much, everyone, for listening, and I hope you have a productive week.